I didn't realize right away why I felt so uneasy. Everything seemed normal. I'd stepped out of the shower, quickly wrapped myself in a towel, and headed to my room. It was quiet and calm. My parents were downstairs. Someone had turned on the TV. And I just wanted to change and crawl under the blanket with my phone. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then I noticed the door wasn't fully shut. Just a crack. Barely a few inches. I walked over to close it and happened to glance out into the hallway. He was standing there. I froze. I had no idea how long he'd been watching, but he saw me too. For a second he stiffened, like he hadn't expected me to notice, then stepped back and left. Just vanished, as if he'd never been there. But that feeling, that someone had definitely been watching, stayed with me the rest of the night. I threw on my pajamas over still damp skin and sat on my bed. Everything inside me tightened. I couldn't figure it out. Was it an accident? Or had he been standing there on purpose? Why? Maybe he meant to say something and changed his mind? Or maybe he just saw the light on and got curious. There were lots of possible explanations. But then why did I feel so exposed? Like I'd been caught doing something private. I didn't tell anyone. Not that night. Not the next day. I just tried to forget. But my body remembered. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I'd go still, listening. I started locking my door, even just to change clothes. I also stopped turning on the light in my room. I didn't want anyone seeing in. It sounds silly now. No one touched me. Nothing really happened. He just looked. But that one moment wouldn't let me go. I've known him since I was a kid. He was my dad's friend, came over a few times a year, stayed for a day or two. Always seemed polite. But that evening, his look was different. I hadn't seen that look before. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I'm just growing up and starting to see things differently. That's possible too. I am changing. I never used to notice people looking at me. Now I can feel it like a spotlight. Maybe the problem isn't him. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm just reading into things. But if that's true, why do I still remember exactly how he stood there, just out of sight, and how his eyes stayed on me a second too long? I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just changing. And yet, I felt like I'd been caught. It's weird how fast moments like that stick in your head. I forgot everything else about that evening. What I had for dinner, what I was thinking before bed. But that one frame, that crack in the door in his eyes, it's like someone hit pause, and now it plays in my mind on repeat. Not angry eyes, not cruel, just too observant. The kind that makes you go silent and hide even when you've done nothing wrong. Since then, I've seen him differently. Not afraid, just cautious. I started noticing how often he's suddenly just passing by. In the kitchen when I walk in, at the stairs when I come down, always seeming normal, but too often to feel like chance. I began to question myself. Maybe I am paranoid. Maybe I do have too vivid an imagination. But then, why do I keep checking that the door's locked every night? Why can't I forget that look? Because technically, nothing happened. Just a shadow in a doorway. Just a glance that lingered. Just a cold trickle down my spine that hasn't left me since. I started noticing more and more how he always seemed to be nearby. Almost by accident. In the hallway when I came out of the bathroom. In the kitchen, just a few seconds before I walked in. By the door as I was leaving for school. It was always the same look. Calm, like nothing unusual, but it made me feel uneasy. I couldn't tell if he was looking past me or right at me. But something inside me stayed tense. Like music playing in the background, and I was the only one who heard a wrong note. My parents were too busy with their own lives. Dad worked late. Mom always said her head was spinning with things to do. They just wanted peace in the house. No complaints. No drama. And I had no idea what to say anyway. I didn't have proof. Just a pattern. Just a feeling. I started doubting myself. Maybe it was all a coincidence. Maybe I was just paranoid. I Googled symptoms, read about anxiety disorders. The more I searched, the more confused I felt. I didn't want to be the girl who makes a scene over nothing. But I also couldn't make myself relax. I stopped staying home alone. I tried coming home later, leaving earlier. Weekends started to feel suffocating because there was nowhere to run. Home didn't feel safe anymore. I started closing off from my friends. When they invited me out, I made excuses, said I was tired, or that my mom needed me to stay in. It wasn't true. I just didn't feel like myself. I felt like I was always on edge. Even when I was in my room listening to music, I found myself pausing to listen for footsteps. At first, it was like a game, tracking them across the hallway, past my door, into the kitchen. But then I realized it wasn't a game. It had become a habit. I needed to know where he was, just to exhale. He hadn't done anything wrong, not openly. Everything looked like normal adult behavior in a family house. And that was the problem. No one else saw anything off. And I started to think maybe I was the one who was wrong. I started taking notes, not intentionally, just little entries on my phone. Time, place, what happened. Like 10:23, walked out of kitchen, glanced at me. I was heading to the bathroom. Sometimes I'd reread them and laugh at how silly it looked. But I kept doing it, because at least that gave me something to hold on to. Some kind of structure. Something solid. Still, the scariest part wasn't him. The scariest part was how fast you stop trusting yourself. When you can't tell if it's instinct or imagination, anxiety or logic, I'd look in the mirror and not recognize myself. Too grown up, too cautious, too quiet. Like something inside me had shifted, and I'd become someone else. It all happened so casually, I didn't even realize how strange it really was. I stayed late at school, extra class, then a long line in the cafeteria. By the time I got out, it was already getting dark. I spotted a car near the entrance. He was behind the wheel. He smiled like it was no big deal and motioned for me to come over. I hesitated, but it was cold and damp, my feet were soaked, and the bus had already left. So I got in, telling myself it was just a ride home. The car was warm and quiet. We drove slowly with soft music playing. I stared out the window while he talked about random things, traffic, work, how fast I was growing up. And suddenly, I found myself actually listening. Not analyzing, not bracing for something. Just listening. I felt calm, almost comfortable. When we pulled up to the house, my hand was already on the door handle. But he didn't rush to say goodbye. The engine was still running. He turned to me and said something that, in that moment, felt warm. Something like how he was glad he could drive me. And when I leaned toward him, just automatically out of politeness, our cheeks brushed. His hand was closer than I expected, and for just a second, I felt his lips on my cheek. It wasn't some innocent, bye, sweetie kind of kiss. There was something else in it. It lasted just a bit too long. It wasn't deep or overtly wrong, but it wasn't what it should have been. I froze. He immediately pulled back, acting like nothing had happened. I jumped out of the car and slammed the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding in my throat. The wind stung my face, but my cheek burned, like something had been stamped there. I rushed to the building and felt my head spinning. I didn't know what that was. Just a gesture? A joke? Or something more? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the ride, how I'd relaxed around him. Why did I feel so safe in that car? Why did I get in at all? Why didn't I bolt the moment I felt his lips? And worst of all, why was there a flicker of something inside me that felt something back? I hated those thoughts. I wanted to erase them. But they came back. Every time I closed my eyes. The next day, I tried to act normal. Laughed at school. Chatted with my friend. But something inside me felt like glass. He hadn't done anything obvious. No big deal. No clear boundary crossed. But I felt like I had stepped over something invisible. Not him, me. like I'd betrayed something inside myself by letting it happen. Or worse, by feeling something from it. I felt ashamed. Ashamed I didn't say anything. Ashamed I ran away and stayed quiet. Ashamed that a part of me didn't just feel fear, but something like a rush. I didn't know if I could even talk about it. To who? What would I say? He kissed my cheek and I felt weird? It sounded ridiculous. No one would get it. No one would believe there was more behind it. Because on the surface, nothing really happened. I tried to avoid him. Stayed out of the kitchen if I heard him in there. Left my room only when the hallway was quiet. I started timing things, like we were pieces on a chessboard, and I just didn't want to end up in the same square as him. At some point, it became routine, an automatic defense. But even with all my effort, I still felt him nearby. Like a shadow that didn't make a sound but was always there. He didn't do anything. No words, no touching. Everything looked normal. He'd greet me, pass by, occasionally comment on something, just like any adult would. But I felt his eyes linger on me, as if he was assessing something. Not in a vulgar or aggressive way, just too long, too focused. And it made everything inside me tighten. Even when he just walked past, I'd start counting his steps. Steps meant distance. Distance meant I could breathe again. My parents didn't notice a thing. I tried hinting to my mom that I felt uncomfortable, but she brushed it off. Said I was overthinking, that he was a kind man, almost family. That's when I understood. No one was going to help. Whatever was happening existed only for me, which meant I was the only one who could protect myself. I started speaking less. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't want to say the wrong thing, the wrong tone, the wrong expression, the wrong word. Like any misstep would be an invitation. Even when nothing happens, you start fearing your own reflection in someone else's eyes. I began hiding in my clothes, long sleeves, high collars, no makeup. I didn't want to look older. I didn't want to be seen at all. My friends started noticing I was pulling away. I wouldn't hang out after school, ignored messages, left voice notes unopened. I just didn't know what to say. What can you say when even you don't understand what's happening to you? I didn't have a story, no incident to point to, just feelings. And you can't screenshot feelings. You can't send them in a voice message. I wasn't myself anymore. Or maybe I was becoming someone else, more guarded, quieter. I'd sit in my room, listening to the creak of the hallway floor, mentally planning escape routes. Where I'd run if the door opened. Where I'd hide if something happened. Even though nothing ever did. Everything was the same on the outside. I just wasn't. Sometimes I'd look in the mirror and try to remember the exact moment when I stopped feeling safe. When did I stop believing that home was a place where I could just be? It didn't happen overnight. It dripped in slowly, silently. And now, when I looked back, it felt like I was living in someone else's house. A place where I had to watch every move I made. The phone was on the kitchen table. At first, I didn't think much of it. Figured someone forgot it. Mom had gone out, Dad was in the garage, and the house was quiet. I just wanted a glass of water. I reached for the cup when the screen lit up. A notification. A message from someone I didn't recognize. I wasn't planning to snoop, but my eyes caught the name. And I realized it wasn't Mom's. It wasn't Dad's. And it definitely wasn't mine. That left only one person. Something tightened in my chest. I didn't want to pry, but I couldn't just ignore it either. The phone was right there. No passcode, wide open, like an invitation. I tapped the screen and swiped up. Unlocked. As if on purpose. I wasn't looking for anything specific. Just opened the gallery. The first photos were normal. Food, papers, random notes. But then, me. Caught off guard. In profile. Reflected in mirrors. Through cracked doors. While I was changing. While I was reading. While I thought I was alone. It was like the air left the room. My hands started shaking. I scrolled through them, one after another, and couldn't figure out When? How? How did I not see this? It wasn't just fear, it was betrayal. Proof that all those feelings weren't in my head. I wasn't crazy. My instincts had been right. He'd been watching. He knew where to stand so he wouldn't be seen. He knew when I was alone. He knew how to act normal around everyone else. Just a harmless guest. I deleted almost all the photos. My hands trembled, my stomach turned. But I saved one. Sent it to myself. I didn't know why. Maybe to have proof. Maybe to remind myself I wasn't imagining it. Or maybe because if I erased it all, it would feel like none of it had happened. But it had. After that, I started acting differently. He came back to the house a couple hours later, and I looked at him through a new lens. Not with anxiety, with a plan. I kept my distance, smiled on autopilot, didn't let a single emotion slip. He couldn't know that I knew. That night, I locked myself in my room. The door shut tight. The photo, the one I'd saved, was hidden under my pillow. I looked at it again and felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not fear, but anger. At him, at myself, at everyone who didn't see what I had to live with. I realized I had to act. Not right away, not rashly, but I couldn't just keep watching in silence. He had crossed a line. I wasn't going to pretend anymore. And that knowledge, it changed everything. I was no longer the girl doubting herself. I had proof now. And that gave me power. He noticed I'd changed. It was obvious. I stopped lingering around him, stopped making eye contact, stopped existing in any space he was in. I tried to be invisible. And ironically, that's what pushed him to act. That day, no one else was home. My parents had gone out for a few hours. I was in the kitchen, reading, trying not to think. He walked in suddenly, as if he'd been waiting for that exact moment. He stood by the door and said he wanted to talk. I didn't answer. I just stared at him, trying to figure out what he was after. He stepped closer, sat across from me, his hands resting on the table. He said he felt the tension, that he'd noticed I'd pulled away, that it mattered to him, that he understood something had shifted. I wanted to leave, just stand up and shut the door behind me. But something made me stay. Maybe anger, maybe the need to hear him explain himself. I stayed silent. He spoke calmly. There was something almost sincere in his voice, like he genuinely didn't understand what he'd done. He talked about trust, about family, about caring. And the longer he talked, the more tangled my thoughts became. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't denying anything. He acted like someone trying to rebuild something important. And for a second, I almost believed him. When he leaned in, it wasn't sudden. It was slow, careful. His hand landed on mine, and I froze. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. He said he missed the way we used to talk, that he missed the trust between us. And then, the kiss. Not on the cheek. Not a goodbye. Short, barely anything. But enough for everything inside me to break. I pulled away, stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor. He stepped back, almost startled. And I saw it. Fear in his eyes. Not fear of doing something wrong. Fear because he knew. Now I truly understood. I left without a word. Locked myself in the bathroom. My hands shook, my head buzzed. I stared at my reflection, heat flooding my face, not from shame, but from the weight of everything that had just snapped. But I knew it wasn't my shame. It was his. I had just absorbed it. I sat on the cold tile floor and for the first time let myself cry. Not from fear, from betrayal. I had really wanted to believe this was all in my head, that I'd overreacted. But now there was no doubt. I could feel it. The line had been crossed. He had erased it. Whether he meant to or not didn't matter. What mattered was that everything had changed. I didn't know exactly what I would do next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. I wasn't ready to talk. I couldn't. But I couldn't stay silent anymore either. Something inside me had cracked. I woke up that morning and felt it. Today, that was it. I packed a bag in 15 minutes, threw in whatever I saw, a charger, a hoodie, a notebook, the photo from my phone. I wrote a note for my parents. I'm at a friend's. I'm okay. But I wasn't okay. I just ran. No plan, no explanations, just the pulsing need to get away from that house. On the subway, I held my backpack like my life depended on it. My phone buzzed constantly. Mom called, then Dad. I didn't answer, not a word. I was on my way to the only person I could even imagine saying something to. When I showed up at her door, she looked startled, said I looked awful. I sat down on her bed and said nothing, for a long time. And then I breathed out. All of it, first in pieces, then in full. She listened, didn't interrupt. And then she said, "You have to tell someone. Not me, someone who can actually help." At first, I pushed back. I didn't want to make it official. I didn't want to drag adults into it. But then she asked me one question. What if he's already doing this to someone else? That shattered something in me. The next day, I went to the school counselor. At first, just for her. Then, for me. I sat across from her and laid it all out. From the first moment by the door to the kiss the night before. She listened quietly. Didn't gasp, didn't pity me. Just took notes. Then she said, "You did the right thing. And you're not alone." Those words unlocked something. I wasn't a prisoner in my own head anymore. My story was out. It wasn't a shadow I had to carry by myself. It was real. And I could finally breathe. I didn't know what would happen next, what my parents would say, how they'd react. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone now. Someone had heard me. Someone understood. And that was enough to stop being afraid of going home. I didn't know what to expect. After I talked to the school counselor, things started moving quickly. She promised it would all be handled gently, quietly. But inside, I was already bracing for the storm. A few days later, someone from Child Protective Services came to our house. No sirens, no shouting, just polite, on schedule. I sat at the kitchen table, Mom beside me, a woman with a folder across from us. Calm, composed, spoke evenly. She asked questions. Mom stayed quiet, nodded occasionally. At one point, she got up and left the room. When she came back, her eyes were red. Dad sat in the corner, hands clenched, eyes on the floor. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue, just listened. And I told them. Everything. Not the painful details, but the truth. It didn't feel like a confession. It felt like a statement. I was scared, but with every word, I felt like I was reclaiming my voice. Mom didn't ask questions, just one after it was over. "Why didn't you tell us?" I didn't know how to answer. Because I thought it was my fault? Because I didn't think anyone would believe me? Or because I spent so long learning how to be easy and quiet? He never came back to our house. Not once. He had someone else pick up his things. No calls, no attempts to explain. Just disappeared. And strangely, that almost made sense. Like he'd known this day was coming and decided not to stick around for the ending. I started going to the school counselor every week. Not because I had to, because I needed it. There was too much inside me that needed somewhere to go. I talked, I wrote, I even drew. Sometimes I just sat in silence. That helped too. I started sleeping again. Deeply, without that constant alertness. I still locked my bedroom door. But something inside began to quiet down. Not immediately. Not like magic, but noticeably. The world started handing pieces of myself back to me. My friend and I didn't talk much about what happened, but she was always there. Silently. Just present. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was everything. My parents tried. Awkwardly. Clumsily. But they tried. Dad stopped disappearing into the garage. Mom started asking how my day was. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a shadow in my own house. The most important thing I realized was this: it wasn't my fault. Not the way he looked, not what he did, not how long it took me to speak. Silence, too, is a form of protection. And protection is not weakness, it's survival. And speaking now, that doesn't make me a victim. It makes me someone who survived. A few months passed. Time moved strangely, sometimes dragging, sometimes disappearing. Something inside me began to shift. I didn't flinch at every sound anymore. I didn't scan the room for exits. I wasn't afraid to say no. Small things, but together, they meant something. At school, they announced a project, a youth conference about safety and support. Anyone could share a story anonymously. They'd be recorded and included in a video montage. I hesitated for a long time. Then I opened my laptop, set a 15-minute timer, and just started typing. I didn't name names, didn't give details. I just told the story, from the very beginning. How you don't even notice when you start losing control. How silence feels safer. How one day you wake up and realize you can't breathe. I wrote everything I'd carried for far too long. When I submitted it, I closed the laptop and held my breath, like I'd finally let something go. Not the pain exactly, something heavy and foggy. I wasn't waiting for feedback. I didn't do it for praise. I just needed someone to hear it. A few weeks later, they showed the final video. Voices altered, faces blurred. But I recognized my words. And to my surprise, I wasn't afraid. I sat in a crowded room and listened to my own story told out loud. It felt distant and fully mine. Goosebumps covered my arms, but I didn't feel shame, just strength. After the event, 2 girls came up to me. They didn't say anything, just hugged me. And that was enough. I realized my story hadn't vanished into nothing. It had become something real, something that might help someone else. My voice had reached into someone else's silence. I went home that evening and felt light. Not euphoric, not victorious, just quiet, the kind I used to fear. It didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt like mine. I lay down on my bed with the door open and realized I wasn't scared. I was calm. Sometimes the memories still come back, in fragments. The crack in the door, the creak of the floor, the photo. But they don't control me now. I know who I am. I know what happened. And most importantly, I know I'm not alone. I didn't become a hero or a fighter, just someone who didn't give up. And that's enough. Sometimes victory doesn't sound like trumpets. Sometimes it's quiet, like an exhale after holding your breath, like one small, shaky step toward yourself.